I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Putin announces a sudden 3-day ceasefire in May, we assess just how meaningful it really is, and ask, why now? Then we analyse another extraordinary weekend of diplomacy at Pope Francis's funeral, before learning more about the history of the Donbas, a region where so much of this war's fiercest fighting has taken place.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 28th of April, 3 years and 64 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and Victoria Donovan, Professor of Ukrainian and East European Studies at the University of St Andrews. But first, over to Dom for the breaking announcement.
Well, hi Francis, hi everybody. So, breaking news in the last half an hour. Putin has announced a 3-day ceasefire in Ukraine covering, I think, May the 8th, 9th and 10th. Kind of worded it's from midnight on such and such a date to midnight on another date. So it's a bit difficult to tell exactly which day it starts. But I think it's all pegged around Victory Day, Russia's Victory Day on May the 9th, marking the end of the Second World War. So it makes sense that it would be the 8th, 9th and 10th. That's what I think. That's what I have seen. But I've also seen some other dates. You'll no doubt see that on social media as well. However, the Kremlin said it expects Ukraine to reciprocate the ceasefire, said it would respond to any violations. They said Russia believes that the Ukrainian side should follow this example. In the event of violations of the truce by the Ukrainian side, the Russian armed forces will give an adequate and effective response. That was a statement coming out of the Kremlin. President Zelensky has said he accused Putin of 2,000 violations in that first ceasefire, made repeated calls for it to be extended for 30 days. You have to ask, why only 3 days? Why only 1 day before? Why not the 30 days that Zelensky was calling for? And why not a full ceasefire that Donald Trump called for and the Ukraine signed up to? Anyway, so that's the breaking news. Just a quick thought on that, if I may. I spoke last week about how even ceasefires need negotiation, or at least an agreed understanding on what is or isn't possible. Otherwise, it's just a gimmick and a trap. So, for example, you have a ceasefire. Does that mean that all movement, other than routine resupply of food, water, medical stuff, ammunition, and so on, is banned? If I have a ceasefire with you and I see your troops, your enemy troops moving forward to get a better look at my positions through binoculars or cameras or drones or what have you, can I open fire on you? If you start building defensive positions, new defensive positions in no man's land, again, can I open fire? Is it a breach of the ceasefire if I fire at any drones that you may be flying over my positions to get a better look at me? So all these things and many, many more considerations on top of them need to be ironed out. Now, the last time, that last ceasefire, when Putin gave only 3 hours notice of such a truce, there was no time to sort out all these little details, these important details. But on this occasion, obviously, if this is May the 8th we're talking about, when this thing starts, there is time to sort out the details. So if Putin is serious about this, and this is not just a gesture to appease Donald Trump after that remarkable meeting at the Pope's funeral over the weekend, we'll be talking about in a moment. If he's serious, we will now see concerted and serious engagement from Russia to iron out these details. Similarly, if we don't see such engagement, we'll know they're not serious. My view, well, two things. I think it is a gimmick to appease Donald Trump. And secondly, I think it is also to protect Victory Day. I think Friday's assassination of that Russian general in Moscow will have massively spooked the Kremlin. And they'll be thinking, are the Ukrainian Special Forces units running around Moscow right now with fibre optic enabled first-person view drones? Obviously, fibre optic enabled drones much, much harder to interdict than radio-controlled first-person view drones. So anyone that has one of those things within 10 kilometres of Red Square poses a massive threat. And the one thing that Putin does not want to see on the world stage, well, for his last few thoughts, would be a drone coming at him with a fibre optic cable dangling out the back. So I think this is a two-pronged gimmick here. Appease Donald Trump and they are worried about Ukrainian special forces running around Moscow. But what are your thoughts, Francis?
Well, thanks, Tom. I agree with the real need for caution here. I think we're going to see the usual suspects get rather carried away. As you say, after all, the so-called Easter truce was so frequently violated. And given those updates I'll share in a moment from the weekend, it seems far, far more likely to my mind that this is Putin trying to show the US that it is not him who is the barrier to peace. And you've stolen my thoughts from me in the sense that I agree. I think the significance of May 9th should not be underestimated given the activities that we saw last week of those bombs going off in Moscow. I think there will be real concerns, if not for particular individual safety, then just for the optics of how bad it would look for there to be major incidents in Moscow amid the huge propaganda initiatives that are driven to try and make Russia look so strong. And so I think it needs to all be understood very, very much in the context of the moment and the political machinations and the concerns of the regime looking weak as it enters those significant dates. It's also interesting as well, just those dates. There's been so much speculation that Putin invited Trump to attend those events. And so again, this would play to the idea of him trying to push this idea that it's deference, we're paying respect to the war dead from the Second World War. How could anybody seek to violate this time? It's all playing up to these rather nationalistic ideas, as well as to the narratives around peace at the moment, which, as we know, it is not Russia that is seeking to really stop. It is very, very much their impetus to keep driving on, as we've seen again and again and again whenever these kind of circumstances have arisen, of opportunities for there to be something more meaningful. But Dom, let's pause there and we'll come back, I think, later on to whether there's been any other updates coming out of this, any reaction from world leaders perhaps. Where do you want to carry on in terms of the military updates that we saw over the weekend?
OK, well, let's go back to Russia. An overnight drone strike last night targeted a key Russian electronics plant in the city of Briansk. This comes from Briansk Oblast Governor Alexander Bogomaz. He said Ukrainian forces had launched a massive attack against the region, with Russian air defences allegedly intercepting and destroying 102 drones. Andrei Kovalenko, an official at Ukraine's National Security and Defence Council, said unidentified drones had attacked the Kremlin plant. That's a major facility specialising in microelectronics for Russia's military-industrial complex. The Kyiv Independent, quoting open Russian sources, say the plant produces components for missile systems such as the Topol-M, the Bulava and Iskander missiles, as well as for radars, electronic warfare systems, drones and the onboard electronics of military aircraft. Now, local media in Briansk said that at least 10 to 15 explosions had occurred. Bogomaz claimed that one civilian was killed and another injured in the attacks. He said they damaged civilian infrastructure, vehicles and residential buildings. There's been no confirmation or comment yet from Ukraine other than that from Mr. Kovalenko, which didn't say a huge amount. Now, over the weekend, until this morning, I would suggest the bigger news would have been that Putin claimed yesterday that Kursk region has been completely retaken. He said they'd pushed Ukrainian troops out of the Kursk region. You remember they moved in there in August the 6th last year. The contention that Russia's retaken all the ground was challenged by President Zelensky yesterday. He said military operations in both Kursk and neighbouring Belgorod Oblast were still ongoing. The deep state map shows the Kursk salient has been degraded over the weekend, but does still suggest some land is held by Ukraine. Also in response yesterday, Ukrainian special forces said they'd conducted a raid on Russian positions in Kursk and captured 2 soldiers. In a statement, they said, while the chief of the general staff of the Russian armed forces, Gerasimov, that's General Valery Gerasimov, reports the liberation of Kursk Oblast from Ukraine's security and defence forces, operatives of the 73rd Naval Special Ops Centre continue to carry out missions in the area successfully. They say during the operation, a unit from Russia's 810th Marine Brigade was targeted and destroyed. Nevertheless, Putin expressed his personal gratitude to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un over the weekend for sending North Korean troops to fight against Ukraine in the area. The Kremlin cited Putin as saying, "The Korean friends acted, guided by the sentiments of solidarity, justice and real camaraderie. We appreciate it a lot, and are deeply grateful to Comrade Kim Jong-un personally and the North Korean people. Answering that, the US and South Korea today denounced North Korea's acknowledgement that they've sent its troops into Russia, the first such acknowledgement, Seoul calling it an admission of a criminal act. Now, a question for you. Putin can't negotiate any kind of ceasefire deal with Russian land still held by Ukraine. It's too much of a humiliation. He said he's not going to do as much. So has the Kursk mission for Ukraine achieved its aim? Its aim of showing the world, i.e. the United States, that Ukraine is capable of launching and sustaining such operations? Has it achieved its aim of illuminating how weak Russia is militarily, such that it needs help from North Korea to eject Ukrainian forces? And I ask you, is it now time for Ukraine to withdraw, if indeed they are still there, to potentially remove an obvious roadblock to negotiations? It is currently an excuse for Putin to not engage seriously in such discussions. So is it time for the Kursk operation to end, I ask you? Anyway, Russia is going big on the whole North Korean involvement thing. Obviously, up till now, they've never confirmed it. We've known for some time. British MODs put out in a number of tweets, and Western officials have said as much, but there's been no official recognition of North Korean soldiers in Russia fighting Ukraine. However, Zvezda News, that's a Russian state-owned TV network run by the Russian MOD, has for the first time published official footage of North Korean soldiers training. So you've got to ask the question, why now? I think the answer, of course, is the context is these negotiations, ceasefire, however you want to call it. You negotiate with any freedoms that you have. The fewer freedoms you have, the less you can negotiate with. So where do Ukraine and Russia get these freedoms from in the current context? I would suggest two places. Firstly, the reality on the ground, and secondly, from the United States. So it's in both sides' interest, firstly, to make great gains on the battlefield. It's also in their interest, if it's not possible to make those gains, just to say that they are. And thirdly, it's in their interest to try to convince the world, primarily the United States, that you are the stronger, unstoppable, omnipotent, unrelenting force, and your opponent is weak, and their defeat is only a matter of time. And frankly, they'd be doing themselves a favour and saving a lot of lives if they just accepted the inevitable and gave in to your demands. So that is what Russia is trying to achieve at the moment with all this North Korea stuff. The reality, of course, is they're going nowhere fast on the ground, except on the motorbikes and scooters they're now having to use as they're running out of armoured vehicles. What gains they are achieving is at enormous cost, another 1,160 casualties yesterday, hence the need for all the North Korean troops. So in order to counter this kind of Kremlin narrative that they're invincible, today we saw a post online from Andrei Sybiha, Ukraine's foreign minister, who says, "The situation on the front line has been and continues to be tense and difficult. Every day, Ukrainian forces confront brutal Russian attacks and hold the line against the overwhelming numbers of the enemy. However, despite enormous efforts and resources, Russia was unable to break through the front and did not achieve strategic success in any of the directions. The overall assumption that Russia is winning the war is incorrect. It is based on a common pattern among foreign analysts of underestimating Ukraine and overestimating Russia. This pattern has been proven wrong many times before. But people keep falling into the same trap. In reality, Russia's last year's and this winter's offensives have mostly lost steam. Ukraine has largely stabilised the front line and even reclaimed some ground near Prosk and other areas." Mr. Sybiha finishes with saying, "Ukraine wants peace more than anyone else in the world. We never wanted this war, and we want it to end as soon as possible. We are working hard, together with the United States, European and other partners, to achieve peace. And this path must be based on accurate information, assumptions and estimates. What we require is pressure on Russia and a clear strengthening of Ukraine, which will deprive Moscow of any illusions that it can turn the tide in its favour. Such measures will force the Kremlin to consider ending the war rather than expanding it." Sorry if I banged on a little bit there, but I thought it was an important intervention from Andrei Sybiha, just trying to set the context here or challenge this narrative that Russian military success is inevitable and therefore going into any quote-unquote negotiations with a stronger hand. Right, last one for me, Francis. Russia is said to have expanded its military presence near the border with Finland in preparation for a possible clash with NATO. This is reporting today from the Wall Street Journal. They say military bases near the Russian city of Petrosavodsk, that's about 100 miles east of Finland, have been expanded That is said to be the new headquarters for tens of thousands of Russian troops. Now, Western military and intelligence officials have warned that these units could form the backbone of Russian forces preparing to confront NATO. Maybe. I doubt it. I don't think they really can. But that's the reporting today from the Wall Street Journal. And that's us up to speed, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. We'll return to talking about the ceasefire again in a moment. But let's look at things are moving so quickly at the moment, the theatre of Pope Francis's funeral, which was a fitting stage for diplomacy this weekend. Just how significant it really was beyond the striking optics I imagine many of you have seen remains to be seen. But let's go through chronologically, because of course we left you last week with Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff about to meet with Putin again. And shortly after our broadcast, the Kremlin released footage of Putin greeting him with open arms in Moscow. The duo was smiling, shaking hands, and even exchanged a few words in English before beginning talks. Now, Putin is understood to be fluent in English, but rarely speaks the language and has only done so on a very few public occasions. So I think it's fair to say the charm offensive is in full swing. But then came the following day, where many of the most significant world leaders were present in Rome for the funeral of Pope Francis. It was said to be the wish of the late pontiff for there to be opportunities for backroom diplomacy. And so, in St. Peter's Basilica, surrounded by marble and all that Baroque splendour, President Trump and President Zelensky had a 15-minute one-on-one after drifting away from Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer, the Prince of Wales and French President Emmanuel Macron. 3 chairs were hastily brought together by Vatican officials in black robes. There was speculation that Macron was originally intended to join them, but the Elysée has dismissed that, saying that the 3rd chair was intended for a translator, but one who was never called upon. Now, we at the Telegraph are reporting that it was Trump who pushed for a one-on-one meeting with Zelensky, a source telling us that Americans had wanted to do this. Compared to that encounter in the White House, both sides praised this meeting. Zelensky described their conversation as potentially historic and very symbolic, saying that he and the president had discussed a full and unconditional ceasefire and reliable and lasting peace that will prevent another war from breaking out. Shortly afterwards, Trump wrote on social media another long post, mainly attacking the New York Times for its critical coverage of Trump's approach to a deal to end the war. But he ended the post as follows: "I'm just trying to clean up the mess that was left to me by Obama and Biden, and what a mess it is. With all of that being said, there was no reason for Putin to be shooting missiles into civilian areas, cities and towns over the last few days. It makes me think that maybe he doesn't want to stop the war. He's just tapping me along and has to be dealt with differently, through banking or secondary sanctions. Too many people are dying." And there were 3 exclamation marks at the end there. The following day, when asked by reporters for an assessment of the situation, the president added, "I want Putin to stop shooting, sit down and sign a deal. We have the confines of a deal, I believe, and I want him to sign it and be done with it. I was just disappointed that missiles were flying, fired by Russia. I see Zelensky as calmer. I think he understands the picture, and I think he wants to make a deal." Now, perhaps understandably, this has got some people very excited, but I think we could see here another example of Trump's tendency to align with, sympathise with the last person that he spoke to, or who spoke to him, should I say, with deference that he feels appropriate. I think at the end of the day, we have seen time and time again more and more evidence that this administration in the White House wants to build some kind of stronger relationship with Russia. Those are the deeds, not the words, that we need to keep returning to. We really need to move beyond focusing on optics now. That sit down with Zelensky, yes, it's very visually striking. But if one looks at the actual spin-outs from it, there hasn't been any really big and sizable announcements. Not only that, Trump seems convinced that Zelensky is ready to quote him, give up Crimea in a peace deal with Russia. Now, that's something Zelensky has said that he can never do, and which European allies last week have also condemned as an approach to trying to end this war. Now, I do get a sense that there is perhaps perceived to be a middle ground, i.e. that the Ukrainians might, if, and it's a huge if, presented with favourable conditions in their eyes that would see the fighting stop, namely security guarantees, they would be willing to accept something that would present the loss of Crimea and certain territories as temporary, but not in a legal sense of signing it away, just in a practical sense in order for the fighting to end. Now, that nuance matters, as I think it's quite often missed in coverage when, say, the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, as he did last week, told journalists that Ukraine may have to give up land as part of a peace deal with Russia. People were keen to point at that and say that that shows a clear wedge between different factions in Ukraine. But if one looks again at what he actually said, and I quote, "It's not fair, but for the peace, temporary peace, maybe it can be a solution, temporary." Now, that last word is really important. It echoes what Valery Zaluzhny, the former commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, said at that event at Chatham House I attended several months ago, that temporarily Ukraine may have to accept the loss of territories in the hope that one day they can be returned politically, say even in a generation or so's time. Now, I'm not saying that that wouldn't mark a huge shift in the Ukrainian position. Of course it would. In 2023, Zelensky was saying that a stalemate would be a temporary weakness and that we have to end the war. To end it, we must end it, he said. But I think the dial may have shifted since then, and that if there is a way, the war could be ended on favourable terms for Ukraine, which would see temporary territories lost in their eyes, but not legally ceded. There might be a narrow way in which they would be willing to accept that. Now, interestingly, the White House, according to the New York Times, has so far refused to support the Russian demand for Ukraine to retreat from the entirety of those 4 Ukrainian oblasts that Putin claims to have annexed, calling it unreasonable and unachievable as a condition. And I agree that certainly that is a red line for the Ukrainians, but perhaps Crimea, with some of the language, would not be. But what of the Russian reaction to all of this? Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, has continued to play up the potential business ties between the US and Russia, saying that the US has clearly indicated it wants to do business with them and that US officials have suggested lifting sanctions on Russia. Now, Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff have denied that, but here you have it from Sergei Lavrov, saying that they have made that proposal. He has pushed back, though, at the suggestion that the US might have any stake in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, something that it does seem was also being discussed and which we could read from the fact that Trump was talking about power plants for a little while. Perhaps most significantly, though, given today's announcement, Russia said it was waiting for a signal from Ukraine to start direct negotiations to end the war, still trying to appear that it is Ukraine that is an obstruction to peace, not Russia. But just finally, some updates on the question of European rearmament, something we were, of course, talking about at detail last week. Poland, over the weekend, unveiled a new national plan that ensures, it says, it has a stronger army than any of its neighbours, which includes Russia. Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister, said that our army must be able to repel any threat. And he said that for Poland must have the strongest army in the region, the strongest economy in the region, and a strong position in the European Union. We are ready to build the strongest army in this part of the world. We do this together, regardless of our views. Now, that will be welcome news to many ears, but it seems that Poland sees its place is to be a key buttress on NATO's eastern flank and therefore does not need to be actively involved in any reassurance force in Ukraine after a ceasefire, or perhaps in extremis before any ceasefire. Many are very disappointed at that position, and what we don't know is how cast iron that is. But this certainly is the Polish view as they are publicly articulating it. The other bit of news is that Johan van Weidevoel, a pro-Ukraine politician from the conservative CDU, will be Germany's next foreign minister, the party has announced. Now, we will do a deep dive into him very soon, I imagine with our very own James Rothwell, Berlin correspondent, of course. But let's just say for now, he's 62 and has long been a very close confidant of Friedrich Merz and is known for pushing for more weapons to support Ukraine, including the long-range Taurus missiles. So, perhaps a further cementing of a more hawkish Berlin. But we've been here before. So that's where we are with the most significant political and military updates. Just before I go to our guest, Dom, you've been watching the wires. Has there been any further interesting reaction to this announcement by Putin of a ceasefire?
Well, no comment I've seen from major political figures, as I think you would you would expect. It's only been a few minutes, so they're probably getting their heads together and working out what to say. However, a couple of comments. Mick Ryan, former Australian general, we've had him on the pod a few times. He said this is another unilateral, cynical truce declaration from Putin. Every time Trump says something negative about him, Putin appears to believe that a truce announcement is the way back into the US administration's good graces. And Phillips O'Brien, professor at St Andrews University, again, spoken to him a number of times on the pod. He says the Russian army is getting mauled. This gives it 3 days to regroup and get more soldiers to the front. Really hard to do with the skies patrolled by drones before it starts attacking again. So not a lot of belief that this is a genuine effort to try and see if there's a way through to a permanent ceasefire.
Interesting. Well, thanks very much, Dom. Let's go to our guest now, Victoria Donovan, Professor of Ukrainian and East European Studies at the University of St Andrews and a specialist in the industrial history and heritage of Ukraine's East, particularly the Donbas region, where so much of that intense fighting is taking place at the moment. All eyes, in some ways, are on there outside of the Kursk salient at the moment. Victoria, welcome. There's lots of different subjects that we can talk about. I know you've got particular expertise as well about post-Soviet cultural memory. Perhaps you can speak a little bit to the significance of May 9th for Putin in the Russia context. But let's just start with this term Donbas itself and why it's deemed by some as problematic. Where do you want to start? Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, so the term Donbas is one that isn't politically neutral. It's actually one that carries quite a lot of political baggage. I think three main reasons for that. Donbas is first and foremost a geological term. So it's a shortening of the name Donetsk Coal Basin, Donbas, Donetsk Basin. And it was one that was introduced in the mid-1800s when a lot of what we're now talking about, valuable minerals, were discovered beneath the ground in this region, in part by foreign industrialists and prospectors. And it was at that time that this region transformed from being one that was relatively strategically unimportant in the eyes of the empire into an extraction resource, basically, a place where you could make a lot of money by extracting the minerals from beneath the ground. So the introduction of that word Donbas is really a signal that that region had transformed from being somewhere that was held little interest into a place that held enormous interest for political actors, both from the Russian Empire and abroad. The second moment that I think is important to underline is that the way in which the term Donbas was instrumentalized in Soviet propaganda. The Donbas region was held up as this flagship region of Soviet industrial modernity. The miners and the steel workers who came from Ukraine's east were the poster boys and girls of labour over production. They were the kinds of workers that the rest of the country was supposed to emulate and admire. You know, just to give you a sense of the way in which the region was propagandized, there's a very famous poster from 1930 that shows Donbas as a beating heart, pumping its lifeblood in the form of coal all around what had been the Russian Empire and was becoming the Soviet Union, from Vladivostok in the east of Russia to Riga in the north and Baku in the south. So this idea of Donbas is this kind of integral cog in a larger machine or a vital organ was one that really pertained across the 20th century, and it still is one that governs the Putinist idea of what this region is today. And then the final moment I just wanted to mention was after 2014. So when the Revolution of Dignity, the Maidan Revolution, took place and Russia retaliated by annexing Crimea and starting its military operation in eastern Ukraine, the term Donbas was really enthusiastically used by pro-Russian fighting groups in the east in the names of military battalions and online and social media. And so then it got toxified really by association with this idea of kind of the Russian world. So it's a term that has a lot of political baggage for that reason, but it should also be mentioned that it is a term that means home for many people. So many people who come from this region still kind of associate that idea with that intimate meaning of home. And so it's complex and it has to be handled with care.
Thank you. Now, Victoria, you've written a new book about this part of Ukraine. It's called Life in Spite of Everything, Tales from the Ukrainian East. And I wonder, another element I must confess I hadn't quite fully grasped until I was reading through your book is just quite how multinational and multicultural Donbas is historically. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I think one of the most successful elements of Russian propaganda has been to paint this region as mono-ethnic, monolingual, part of this sort of quote-unquote Russian world sphere of influence. That is very much a distortion of the truth, because this region is a historic borderland. It was a place where empires intersected, a place that Mary Pratt would call a contact zone, an imperial contact zone, where lots of different nationalities and cultures and languages came into contact. And as a result, there's a lot of cultural hybridity and diversity. Just to give you an example of how that works, in Mariupol, which we all know a lot about now, very sadly, there was an ethnic minority of what were known as Mariupol Greeks, Azov Greeks. And those Greek community ended up in Mariupol partly because of Catherine II, also known as Catherine the Great, her colonial politics in the mid-1700s. So Catherine, when she first colonized parts of southern and eastern Ukraine, colonized those same lands that now Putin is recolonizing, she had this territory that then she wanted to settle with new settlers from the Russian Empire. So she made a lot of incentives for people to come and settle there. You could avoid military service if you moved there. You got much more land than you could have in other parts of the empire. You got given an oxen. Historian Olivia Durrant has written about this in her research. But she also forcibly moved some peoples to this new land, which she called Novorossiya, New Russia. And as we know, Putin tried to recycle that term too when he recolonized this territory. And one of the peoples who she moved was the Greeks from Crimea, who had been there for many thousands of years. She moved that ethnic minority in their entirety from Crimea to this sort of area along the coast of the Azov Sea. And the Greeks refounded their cities that they'd left in Crimea. So you have a Yalta in southern Ukraine in the same way as you do in Crimea. And as you can hear, Mariupol has that upol ending like Constantinople. So Mariupol was also founded by Greeks. So that's just an example of how you have these different ethnicities moving in this borderland region, which had been newly colonized.
Thanks, Victoria. As you say, much more of a melting pot of a region than perhaps many appreciate, not least, of course, in that way that we've covered on the podcast before, which is the reference to Hughka, named after John Hughes, who was a Welsh miner who settled in part of today's Donetsk with a large community of Welsh miners to be part of the mineral extraction, as well as, of course, like coal and other key industries of the 19th century. But let's actually go into there next, shall we? Because, of course, we've talked a lot about the extractivist politics of the present moment, Trump talking about minerals deals and everything else. What are the historical precedents for that?
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of put Trump's grab for Ukraine's minerals in historical perspective, because it's much more of a continuity than a change, I think, across time. If we look back to the 19th century, there were many different foreign industrial capitalists who were interested in extracting Ukraine's minerals, including the British, as you just mentioned. So towards the end of the 19th century, the Russian Empire put in place these kinds of fiscal reforms that attracted foreign capitalists to all parts of the Russian Empire to develop industries, from the shipyards of St. Petersburg to the oil fields of Baku. But Donbas presented a very particular attraction for foreign industrialists because it contained so many different minerals. So foreign industrialists in the 19th century were interested in the coals. Donbas has 3 different types of coal: iron ores, gypsum, salt, and chalk. And industrial elites from all over Western Europe and even the US as well relocated their industries to the region in the last decades of the 19th century in order to extract these minerals and make a lot of money as a result. And often they partnered with Russian business elites too. So both the imperial center in the Russian Empire and also business elites back in Western Europe all profited from the extraction of the mineral resources that this region holds. And I think it's interesting because the way that history has often been presented in the UK is quite romantic. So, Hughes and Hughka, who I've done a bit of work on, he came from South Wales. Obviously, South Wales was quite a sort of developed industrial centre at that time. And he relocated with around 100 mining engineers and chemists and other managers to what is today's Donetsk. And whenever that history is written about, it's often written about in terms of him being an intrepid pioneer, adventuring over to this quote unquote barren steppe in order to found this new industrial community there, and how British industrial expertise and knowledge allowed industry to thrive in Ukraine. But we have to think about it more critically than that, because it was part of this history of extractive colonialism. And we have to understand that, the Welsh, when they were present there, even though it is quite funny and interesting to think about them present on the steppe, kind of recreating British traditions like amateur dramatic societies and tennis courts and tea circles, that they were actually also part of these processes of violent industrial extraction that were quite exploitative of local communities. The workforce from all parts of the Russian Empire lived there in fairly abject poverty. And also, just one more point on that is that this history has been romanticized in Ukraine as well, for reasons that are quite easy to understand, because it presents a counter narrative to that toxic Russian world idea that Donbas has always been part of Russia's sphere of cultural influence. And by linking with the history of European industrial development and extraction, there's a possibility of telling a different story about how this region is linked with Western Europe. But it has to be dealt with critically, because it wasn't a philanthropic process. It was a process of profit making and extractivism.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Victoria. Well, let's focus in on the Ukrainian cultural experience then in Donetsk and wind forward in time. I know that you were visiting Mariupol in November 2021, and your experiences there highlight another aspect of this part of the country, which is, of course, its cultural activism.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's another misconception about Donbas that before the full-scale invasion, because of the heavy industry there and the war that had been ongoing since 2014, that it was kind of like a cultural wasteland, that there wasn't that much going on there. And that is really very far from the truth. Most of my field work in the region was done between 2019 and 2021. And I had the opportunity and the privilege to travel quite widely to a lot of different cities that we now hear about because of their complete destruction and the displacement of their population. So I went to places like Bakhmut, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Mariupol, as I already mentioned. And what was really striking was how much cultural activism was happening there. And this was partly because activists had been displaced from larger urban centres after 2014. So activists had moved from places like Donetsk and Luhansk when they were occupied, and they'd moved to some of these smaller urban places like Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. And actually, Mariupol was really well known in the region as being one of the most dynamic centres of activism. There were feminist art collectives and queer filmmakers who were present in that city, who were doing really remarkable work, kind of exploring life in the vicinity of heavy industry, also working with young people to develop sort of their civic activism and teach them about how to petition local politicians to make changes to ecological policies, write letters that would make local governments sit up and take notice to design posters that could go viral on social media, all of that sort of thing. Yeah, and it was really quite a remarkable place to travel around before the full-scale invasion. I met, for example, a young curator, Lysychansk, who was curating pop-up exhibitions in derelict buildings there, which included artworks by artists from all over the Luhansk and the Donetsk region, and were really remarkable ways of kind of trying to understand the region's past and its present, but also imagine for it an alternative future. With the start of the full-scale invasion, cities and infrastructures were destroyed, but also these remarkable communities of activists were displaced. And so that work is also something that this war has really done damage to. But it's work that's really important to remember, because the government-controlled Donbas region was really a very vibrant cultural place, very rich with lots of different perspectives and ideas before the full-scale invasion. And it shouldn't be just thought of as a zone of heavy industry and war.
Thanks, Victoria. And just to bring us up to date a little more, as it were, can you tell us about the project you're involved in about Prosk? Of course, we've spoken so much about that vital city and its role in the fighting at the moment. And I know that you're involved in an exhibition relating to it.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for talking about Prosk so much. I had a summer school there in 2021, and it was a lovely city, a small mining city, very beautiful in summer, full of kind of fruit trees and very green and lovely. And, you know, when I hear you talk about it on the podcast, it brings up all of these memories. And it's very important for everybody who comes from that place that, you know, it's kept in the public eye. So thanks for the work you're doing around that. So the project that I'm involved in builds on work that I've been doing for many years with partners in Ukraine. My partners at the Centre for Urban History in Lviv, and also museums in eastern Ukraine, including the Pokrovsk Local History Museum, the now destroyed Mariupol Local History Museum, and the displaced Donetsk Local History Museum, which was displaced to Kramatorsk, now displaced again. And we worked with those museums between 2019 and 2021, digitizing a lot of their collections because of the precarious nature of the situation that they were existing in. Now, obviously, in the case of the Mariupol Local History Museum, the materials that we digitized are the only ones that are left, because the museum was destroyed during the siege in 2022. The Pokrovsk collections, they include the photography archives by local photographers who photographed the town in the late Soviet period. These really remarkable documentations of local life with kind of things you might expect, like kind of miners and mining demonstrations, but also really unexpected things like a flamenco club that was part of the local cultural scene, or people kind of celebrating birthday parties, or having kind of local celebrations and that sort of thing. So these really nuanced, textured depictions of local life that are very important, again, given that the city is now being almost completely destroyed. We're working with a really amazing organisation in Dnipro, because the museum, part of the museum collective, has now been displaced to Dnipro. They're based there. And we're working with the Dnipro Centre for Contemporary Culture to curate an exhibition where we'll show some of this archival photography, but we're also working with artists to make new responses to that work and to think about what it means now to remember a town that has been almost completely destroyed, and how archives can allow us access to the past of those places, but also try and help us to kind of keep them alive in our imaginations and in culture.
Absolutely. One final question, Victoria, if I may. We, of course, have seen how this war has developed and Putin's objectives to seize the entirety of the country. And now the fighting has been moved far more focused on Donbas and obviously other parts of the country too, but particularly in Donbas. I wonder if you can just speak to what you think Putin's ideological objectives are. I mean, there's so much talk about this concept of Novorossiya. Do you see that if he can't get the entirety of Ukraine, that this is, as it were, the second best part that he can take? Or is that oversimplified of an understanding of this part of the region in Russia's cultural consciousness?
Well, yeah, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think this region has always had such a lot of symbolic power in the Soviet era, and that has continued to inform the way it's understood by Russia now, the idea of it as this kind of integral part of a broader body, and the fact that it is so mixed up with that Soviet ideological politics, it kind of remains symbolically very important. And I think it has always been a region that has been in Putin's sights. I hope very much that, we are able to continue to resist this, and there isn't a kind of turn to be more sympathetic to the idea of giving up this region, which is, fought for so long to repel Russian invaders, 11 years of fighting and so much loss already. It would be so devastating for the people who are displaced from that region to see it lost now. It has to remain Ukrainian.
Well, Victoria, thank you very much for your time today. And we'll, of course, have a link in the show notes to your new book on this part of the world. Dom, where do you want to leave listeners today?
Well, let's go to Lithuania, shall we? So a tweet earlier on today by Dovyl Sakhalin, who's Lithuania's defence minister, said, "As someone who has worked in the field of human rights for many years, I have a piece of advice for those criticising our decision to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention. Wake up. This is the real world. We are defending our citizens and we will use every single measure at our disposal. And if a measure isn't available, we will make it available. Russian soldiers will never cross my country's border again." So why do I raise this? Well, you'll remember the Ottawa Convention is the anti-personnel mine ban treaty. Lithuania, Poland, Latvia and Estonia announced their planned withdrawal from it last month. There's a great article last week in The Economist titled "The Ugly Task of Putin-Proofing Your Border." But the whole issue about rolling back established norms in the military field as much as anywhere else is a very hot topic right now. We interviewed, you may remember, the Halo Trust Chief Exec James Cowan. We spoke to him on April the 4th. That was day 1136 of the pod, if you want to look that up. Very interesting guy, very interesting, very thoughtful response to that announcement. I put it to him at the time about what he thought about countries going back on the Ottawa Convention. And he said that whilst he understood the country's positions, he was still very much opposed to the use of anti-personnel mines and didn't see the reason for going back on the treaty. Anyway, I mention it because there are many ways the international order is being reshaped right now. This, I think, is one of arguably the most important. And Ms. Sakhalin's comment today, I think, is a very interesting, helpful contribution in terms of the debate, but very interesting in terms of the direction of travel. Well worth having a look.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. And of course, stay with us this week following the announcement of today, a significant one, although perhaps not as significant as some would like. But Victoria, as our guest and as a listener to the podcast, you know the ropes here. You are our guest, so you have the very final words for today. Where would you like to leave listeners?
If I may, I'd just like to highlight a couple of the amazing artists who are still doing humanitarian work in eastern Ukraine, and one in particular. So I mentioned the activists who I met in Mariupol. One of those communities is called the Freefilmers NGO, and they're a group of independent filmmakers who were working with local communities in Mariupol and are now doing incredible humanitarian work out of Zaporizhia, but still working with those people in need in the occupied territories and doing so much. Right now, they're developing equipment and providing parts for grassroots workshops that develop and assemble drones. They're providing medical equipment and first aid to military doctors. And they're also helping refugee Roma families in Zaporizhia. So I would like to highlight their work and just say that you can donate to support them on their website.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery, so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.